Hello everyone and welcome to our first webinar in conjunction with the Royal Aeronautical Society, and today we're going to be discussing return to work. We have a brilliant panel today. We actually have an additional panelist for you, which is fantastic news. And it's a good opportunity for us to discuss some of the non-technical side of returning to work, discussing some of your fears and apprehensions. Firstly, I'd just like to introduce myself and give you a format of how the panel or how the webinar will actually work. So initially what we'll do is we'll have a fireside discussion with our panelists, and we'll talk through some main themes about what we consider to be important and some of the concerns that have been raised about what happens when we do return to work. Then we'll have a question and answer session, which will be on for about 30 minutes, and you can text in to do that. There is you can actually send in your questions at any point during the webinar. However, I would just ask, there is a hand up function. We won't be responding to those at the time, so if I could just ask you to write in your questions at any point during the webinar, we'll moderate those and try and filter them in at the right time so we can answer them and put them to our panel. That said, if we have any questions at the end that we're not able to answer, then what we'll do is we'll actually try and answer them for you, and we'll put up an email at the end of the webinar just to so you can send your questions in, and we'll try and answer them for you. So firstly, if I could just move on to the next slide. So we'll have a look at, as I said, here is the email if you want to send it into careers@aerosociety.com if there's anything you couldn't be answered. There's also useful resources available in the handouts tab, which is for you to take away, and there's some links on there for you to stay connected at the end of the webinar. So just to start then, just start by introducing myself and the theme. So my name is Marnie Munns. I'm a commercial airline pilot. I've been in the industry about 20 years. I started my career initially prior to joining the airlines in the University Air Squadron, and then I went on and got a sponsorship with Aer Lingus. I then worked for a charter company for a few years on the Boeing 737-800, and then I moved on to my current company where I fly the A320 Airbus. I'm also a captain in that company at the moment, and I also do some training outside the company as an MCCI, so quite well versed in the non-technical side of our job. So that's my introductions. I've spoken enough, so let's move on to our brilliant panel today. So Alan, do you want to kick us off with an introduction, a bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, as you can see, my name is Alan Snow. I am, like everybody else, I suppose, furloughed at the moment, and it's been a sort of interesting experience. Like Marnie, captain on the A320 at the moment. I've had all sorts of different careers before flying. Indeed, I did all sorts of different things, so flying is not the only thing I've done, but I have, like Marnie, been in the industry for quite some time. I suppose probably about 30 years now, the best part of. Worked through all sorts of typical self-improver route, club pilot, flight instruction, over in the States, back to Ireland, initially all the way up to a single pilot night freight and little twin turboprops and all that sort of stuff, multi-crew, 727 through hunting cargo, air contractors, then to Virgin Express with 737 with passengers, and subsequently now to Go and on to other airlines since then, where I'm now flying the Airbus. Outside of that, I suppose I also an MCCI and TRI do some external work. Have experienced the whole return to work thing several times for various reasons, including redundancy and various medical issues over the years, all of which have been interesting experiences in one way or another. As I said, part-time now, which has its own challenges, I suppose, in terms of having more significant periods off work than you would have normally. And even oddly, last summer I was extraordinarily lucky with leave, and even despite the fact that I wasn't sick, wasn't medically unfit or anything like that, or made redundant, I had almost the entire summer away from work. So even coming back to work after extended leave period was a challenge. So I guess all sorts of reasons why we potentially find ourselves in this situation, but yes, the return to work thing has always been interesting and in its own way and challenging, but also satisfying process. So that's me. I'm almost at the end of my flying career, by the way. So I'm almost done. Time for someone else to sit in the left-hand seat.
Thank you, Alan. Zoe, what about yourself?
Hi, welcome everybody to Marnie's webinar. My name's Zoe Ebury. I'm a line training captain on the A320. I've been in commercial aviation around about 15 years. I've been flying for most of my life, gliders, light aircraft and so on. I've done 3 separate return to work events. 2 of them were after my children. I was off for 13 months each for those, and I've done one where I was absent for around about 2 months. Thank you everyone.
Thank you, Zoe. What about Ivan? And welcome Ivan, who's come and join us at the very last minute. So thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about your career?
Hi everybody. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I've been in the industry for about 26 years. I've flown for a couple of different airlines in Asia and also one in Europe as well. I've got about 10,000 hours on the 737 and about 4,000 on the Airbus. I'm also a sim instructor and examiner. I've done various return to work. So I haven't done any myself, but I've conducted return to work sims on other people. So that's kind of my background. I'm in between jobs at the moment, and that's about it really. Any questions anybody's got to ask me, feel free.
Thank you, Ivan. Thanks again. Rob.
Hi everybody, Rob Bryce-Smith. I joined Air Europe in the late 80s, having been in the University Air Squadron and done the self-improver route as a flying instructor. After the Air Europe collapse, went to Air UK for 9 years and spent the last 20 years with a large UK airline, currently flying the A320. Been sim training since 96, examining since 2004, now 50% part-time. I'm involved in running an MCC course locally and often found in my glider. I recently did a return to work myself about, after nearly a year off from flying, which was interesting, and delivered several, many return to works over the years.
Thank you, Rob. And Nuala.
Hi everybody,
Hi,
I'm Nuala, and originally I was a dentist, and after a few years of doing that I decided I really want to fly. So I was lucky enough to start on the Shorts 360 over 20 years ago, and then the ATR, and like the others I've been with a large UK airline for the last 20 years, flying the 737 and the Airbus. Like Rob, I'm part-time 50%, and I work 2 days most weeks, and quite often with leave and everything that feels sometimes like return to work every time I go back to work. So I just have some ways of helping to keep my mind engaged and make that process a bit easier. So thank you all for joining us.
That's brilliant. As you can see, we've got a fantastic array of experience, and every one of us here has at some point either conducted return to work or actually been involved in being returned to work ourselves. So that's actually one of the first themes that we will be looking at today, is actually the return to work process is pretty normal in the airline industry. However, when you start your career, it's not something you always think about. What happens if I have time off, and how will the airline manage me coming back in? And I think this process has a lot of anxiety attached to it. So what we're going to do in our first theme, if we could have our first slide, is just ask the panel to discuss actually how normal is it to return to work? So should we be worried about return to work courses when we go back into the airlines? And in your experience, is it fairly common to be doing return to work, and perhaps what's unusual about it at the moment?
Maybe I should kick off.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
I think first and foremost, I don't think you should be concerned about returning to work at all. The whole point of a return to work course is to support you. It gives you the opportunity to demonstrate to yourself that you've got that skill set already, and that it's there to design to help you return your confidence in the skill set that you already have.
And what sort of thing can we perhaps expect why pilots would be off for work? And you know, in your experience, what have you seen pilots being off for work for, apart from furlough, which is obviously the most common thing at the moment?
Illness is obviously one. For the ladies amongst us, maternity, but then for the gentlemen as well, paternity. Some people take quite some time off when they first have children, and so there's many reasons.
I think I mean, for me, it came as a bit of a surprise. I mean, the reasons mostly I've been off work through the last decade at times has been through medical issues, and I guess you know, in the more advanced years, and probably the rest of you, certainly the rest of you, and I'm sure most people listening, it's not something you particularly expect, but it shouldn't be that unusual a process either. I mean, it would be extraordinary, no matter what your career was, if you went through your entire working life without having time off for some reason or another. I suppose the problem with our work, or the problem we perceive with our work, is we worry if we'll ever go back to work, for one thing. So anxiety is an issue, and I guess anxiety is an issue for all of us at the moment. But it shouldn't be a surprise event that we have to deal with. It should be, although we don't expect it to happen, but it shouldn't be thought of as a normal event, and something which we could prepare for at any time. I guess having been off before, you're anxious about whether you'll ever go back to work. Maybe you had your last flight and never actually experienced it as your last flight, but it's although not a normal thing, it shouldn't be thought as extraordinary either.
I think some people also take return to work as every year, don't they? They take the winter off, come back in the summer after 6 months off. There's some people who've been doing that for some years.
Yeah.
I mean, how many, just out of interest, just from our own panel, how many, I know, Ivan, you mentioned you've conducted lots, but how many of us have actually experienced return to work, and what are the average? I mean, for example, I've done at least 3 or 4 return to work, whether it be for children, bereavement, life events. What about yourselves? How many return to works have you all done?
I think I've done 5 over the last 13 years. I was lucky enough to be diagnosed with arthritis, much to my surprise, at 50, which has led to a number of surgeries. So I was sort of hobbling around on crutches, and clearly inappropriate to try hobbling up the steps of an aircraft with crutches on. So the company decided I better not go to work in that state. So yeah, about 5, and some of them being for, I think the longest was for just over 5 months. So quite a considerable period. Other times, you know, shorter than that, but everyone is a challenge. So quite a few in my case, anyway.
I've done one for I've done one for a medical reason, medical investigation, but I've done probably 3 where I've gone out of recency. You know, being part-time and a sim trainer, you suddenly find yourself out of the recency requirements. So done some line training, return to work, which it's been great fun. Been good.
All positive thoughts there about returning to work. Which is good. So what's unusual about the current situation in returning to work, in your opinion?
The fact that everybody has been off sort of at the same time. So normally when you go back, you can rely on your colleagues to be quite current and up to speed, and you think they'll pick me up if I get something wrong. Whereas now we've all got to be mindful that we're all in the same boat. We're all affected by the same stresses and anxieties. So, but I think, like you said, Alan, they want to get you back to work, and we all have the competencies to do that. So, you know, we can think about how we can prepare for it, and if we're mindful of that, you know, the fact that we're not current, we can prepare for that.
I think this what's different about this return to work, I suppose, for each of us individually, is it's not an individual experience now. It's a thing that affects all of us. It's a very equalizing experience, which I guess in a way affects that whole support from our colleagues thing. Because on previous return to works, I've always assumed, probably correctly, that, and in fact, even probably on most days I go to work anyway, that my colleagues are more competent, more knowledgeable, more able, more skillful, etc. Whereas now we're probably all going to be equally anxious going back to work, and in a different way, perhaps being able to be supportive to each other, by sharing our anxieties rather than feeling of them individually. I think everyone's going to be pretty much in the same boat, feeling concerned about our performance, etc. And as an individual performance as a crew.
Do you have any advice for new pilots going back? So that some of them may have only done their first line flight. Do you have any advice for new pilots going back? How do you think the company might support them?
I think you have to go into this thing knowing that the company is supportive. I mean, the reality is the company has a vested interest in you returning to work, and rather than not. I mean, I think historically we've always gone to the sim thinking, you know, expletive deleted, this is a stressful experience, that I might fail, I might not do well, and the consequences of that. But now, you know, the company needs us to pass, it needs us to be successful. So I think we should go to this process, those of us who are fortunate to go to return to work, ultimately knowing that a company is there to be supportive and have a vested interest, of course, in us being successful. And I'm sure that's got to be the mindset for our employers, whoever they may be, that okay, we're under test, we are expected to meet certain standards, but nevertheless the company needs us to come out at the end of that sim experience having at least been able to demonstrate safety, if perhaps not the normal performance, the normal targets that we previously expect for ourselves, or even the company would expect for ourselves. There may be more debriefing points perhaps than heretofore, but that's going to be okay.
I think that's very, very valuable. Just out of interest, I just want to run a quick poll now of our audience. So in a minute, we're going to come up with our first poll, which is to look at how many years you've actually been in the industry. So it'll be interesting for our panelists to know what kind of experience level we have in the audience today. So Nick, if I could ask you to put a poll number 1 up for me, and you should be able to see that in the audience. So if you could complete that, we'll just take a couple of minutes to complete that for me.
Not on this. Yeah. My iPad is
right. So I think we have a good turnout. Thank you everyone for completing that. So if we could close the poll, that would be great. Thank you for voting on that. So just as a bit of feedback, which is really interesting for our panel, most people, well, we've actually got a 50-50 split, those that are less than 5 years in the industry and those that are more than 5 years in the industry. So it's a great opportunity to sort of cover early career and perhaps later on in your career. So thank you everyone for giving us that update. So moving on to theme 2. So as we all know, we've all had different experiences being off, but predominantly we've been furloughed. But in that furlough experience, there are other people who've been doing different types of training and possibly caught up in different stages in their lives. So perhaps, Ivan, this might be something for you. What can we expect as our first day back at work, and what does it actually depend on our first day back in any company that we go back to from a sort of licensing point of view?
You mean first day back as in simulator wise or on an aircraft wise?
Well, both. It could be that what determines what our first day back will look like. So would we be in the sim? Would we be on the line? How would a company decide where we would go back?
Yeah, well, I assume it would generally depend on how long you've been off and where you are maybe in your cycle of your simulator. I think most people have been off for 3 months now, so they would expect to have to go into the simulator, probably do 3 takeoffs and landings, or maybe 2 takeoffs and landings in a simulator, and then their third one be on the aircraft. A lot of people are coming up to their expiries on their 6-month simulator check, so their takeoff and landings should be combined within that simulator check, so then they could just go straight onto the aircraft after that. Within the 3-month period, there's not too much extra, I think, that would have to be done in a simulator check. If you've been off longer for like 6 months or something, you would possibly have a couple of days in the classroom doing technical stuff, and then maybe 1 or 2 days in the simulator before going into your simulator check. But 3 months off, I would imagine either just takeoffs and landings, or being combined with your 6 monthly simulator check, and then going on to line with probably a few sectors with a trainer or something like that.
And how, has anyone got any advice about how we would find out about that? Give us a clue about where we should be looking for that kind of information.
The ATO will organise that for you. So they've got a lot of experience. They'll look at what you've done, what you haven't done, and they'll create a training program for you. So you'll have that rostered and delivered or scheduled. And then you just go and do it, and they've got a lot of experience. These companies have a lot of experience of doing this, so go with them. And just remember, it is a team effort. Team between the company and us lot, and then when you're actually doing it, a team effort between the trainer and the trainee.
So pilots, especially. Sorry, go on, Alan.
To add to that, as Rob says, it comes up with a program, but on certainly at least one of my return to works, I was rostered for simulator, as Ivan was saying, and line training, etc., with a certain number of line sectors with a trainer, after which I still wasn't particularly comfortable with being responsible for the aircraft by myself. So I just said to the trainer and instructor, I just want some extra sectors, and the company were quite happy to accommodate that. So we have a certain degree of control ourselves over our training program, or at least I did anyway, with my employer. And I dare say any employer, if they're approaching this in a sensible way, would do the same thing. Who wants to have a captain or a first officer or any crew member at work if they're not comfortable but competent at completing their job safely? So I would say, don't be shy. If you don't feel confident, then feed that back to the company or whoever is with you in the flight deck or simulator, or whatever it may be, and exert a certain degree of control of your own program. And don't try to do it.
Realize different people
admit that you're not competent or don't feel competent.
Ivan.
Yeah, sorry, you've got to realize that different people learn at different rates, or more experienced pilots should be able to come back to work a lot more comfortably than newly qualified pilots. But if a newly qualified pilot requires extra landings in a simulator or anything like that, the instructor should recognize this and provide extra time for it. And if they don't, then as Alan says, just ask, and they should be able to fit some extra time in to tailor the training where it's needed.
Yeah. And obviously there's quite a lot of pressure at the moment, but in essence, we need to trust the organisations they still have a responsibility to train us up to a comfortable level. So the ATOs trust in what the training package you've been given, and go with that training package. So that's in essence what we're trying to say here. Does anyone like to add to that at all in their experience? So just out of interest, we're just going to run our second poll of the webinar. I'd like to find out how many people, how many return to work training packages our audience have done themselves. So if we could run that second poll, it would just take a couple of seconds to run that. So if you could answer that for me. And if we could close that poll. Very interestingly, from an audience and panel's perspective, 69% of our audience today have said they've never done a return to work. So I think that just shows that actually something like this, discussing hopefully we're going to move on now onto what can help you return to work and some of the strategies we all use to go back to work. So thank you everyone for responding to that. So that's 70% of the audience say they have not done return to work before. So hopefully this is providing a useful insight into how they can help themselves get back to work. So let's have a look at our third theme, which is the simulator and areas to focus on. So there are probably going to be two parts to your return to work. One will be simulated training. In a minute, we'll discuss the line element of it. They both have quite different feels about them. So what sort of training does the simulator focus on generally? In your experience, and also as a line trainer, but also as having experienced it yourself, what did you, in your experience, find that it focused on?
Well,
Nuala, did you want to? So go on.
Sorry, Nuala, do you want to?
No, you carry on.
I suppose in my case, it's really just initially just feeling comfortable. It is a rather strange place to return to after being away for a while, and you kind of, I think, just a degree of normalizing yourself in the seat and in the environment is the first thing to think about. You will feel slightly strange returning to that position, and probably sort of trying to second guess all the things that may come up and events that may present themselves to you. But just, I think, managing your own stress or whatever is probably an important thing to think about. Just don't go into the whole experience being stressed and worried and concerned. Just be prepared to enjoy it and be relaxed. And as a very first thing to focus on. I don't know if any of the
what sort of tip
instructor, sim examiner people have a different perspective on it.
No, my perspective is exactly the same. I think the big thing is it takes everybody longer to do the same tasks that they did before they finished, before they broke up for the time off. So you get into the sim feeling rusty, you feel slow. Sometimes you're not that slow, but you might feel slow. And I think it's fair to say that occasionally you get these blank sort of bits of, your mind goes blank and you think, hang on a minute, what am I supposed to do now? And that's quite normal. And so from a trainer's perspective, you're kind of looking out for that and actually trying to pace the training program or the training session to allow for that. And the syllabus will allow for that. It will build it up nice and gently. It will give you the chance to build it up gently. And don't forget, this time round, there's going to be a few oddities as well. I think we'll be wearing masks. We'll have to be getting into the seat one by one for social distancing. So it's going to be a rather odd situation. So I think don't worry about taking your time. And as Alan said, you're going to have periods when you get in the aircraft, and all of us are going to go, where the hell's that switch? And you're going, oh yeah, got it now. So then you get, and it's what it is. It's if we didn't need to do the return to work, we wouldn't do it. So in many ways, it's one of those things that has to happen. And actually, they're incredibly positive experiences. But I think, as Alan also said, there will be anxiety, and the anxiety will be almost all, or the pressure will be all, from the trainee. So don't think about the instructor placing pressure on you. There's no need. That makes sense.
I think there's also a risk we tend to be, because I suppose we work in a very technical environment, we tend to be a bit technical minded. And as we all know, there are lots of apps and things like that which are there to help us and sort of prepare us going through procedural things and dealing with failures and malfunctions and whatnot. But I think there's a risk we maybe just focus almost entirely or too much on technical stuff, remembering that there are other aspects to our experience and skill base that are not technical at all. Consider the competencies, which include, of course, other assets like your colleague in the flight deck, or even your instructor / examiner on your line training. There are other things which we can focus on apart from just the techie things, and knowing what in the individual components of the aircraft or computers might be doing. Think about your communication skills. They may have got a bit fuzzy over the years. You might have forgotten some of the SOPs. And I was referring to what Rob was mentioning a few seconds ago about forgetting where one of the Norway switches. I can remember a sort of slightly amusing, well, it made me laugh anyway, event when one of my first takeoffs in the sim and return to work, I could not remember how to set standard on the Airbus. I just couldn't remember. It's the thing you do, God knows how many times a day, a week, a month, a year when you're flying. And I was sitting there clear to a flight level by the instructor. I couldn't remember how to do it. And so I just sort of had to go ask the first officer, how in heaven's name do you set standard on this thing? I can't remember. And it will surprise you, or surprise me, the simple things that you just forget. They just things you do without having to think about it, using total sort of brain motor memory for years and years and years. And once you have to think about something, you just lose it. So don't be surprised about what you don't know how to do, and just ask and get the help you need.
I think that's really important, Alan, what you've just said, because everything we normally do, we're repetitive. We do it over and over again, every day, several times a day, and we haven't for 3 months so far. And that's what I found is basically those skills are all there. It's how you access them. And I guess it's what cue do you use to access that repetitive task that you know so well. I think so. I kind of, when I went my return to work, a lot of the stuff I did was looking at the SOPs by flight phase and just picking out what the cue is for that procedure or that task that happens afterwards. So the pilot flying, selecting the ignition back to normal is the beginning, is the cue for the flow that comes after that, for the after start flow. And so it was picking up things like that through the SOPs just to remind myself, so that when I did go to the simulator, those kind of normal things, at least I'd thought about the cues that I needed to link in with, to follow through with the tasks that needed to be done afterwards. And that kind of helped me to sort of frame some of the work you have to do. I mean, being off for a very long period of time, rereading the SOPs from sort of one end to the other is a bit like War and Peace, to be honest. Certainly in my airline, and I'm pretty sure that most people's. And so I found that quite a lot had changed in the period that I was off, and some things I hadn't even noticed had changed. And so I was quite surprised that there was quite a lot of things that had changed in SOPs that I hadn't picked up. And so it's quite a good thing to go through them, but it's also very laborious. It's quite a difficult task to do.
Yeah, I would agree.
What about your experience in terms of, I know that for myself, sometimes when you've practiced or you've thought about what's going to happen immediately after takeoff if I'm given engine failure, what are your sort of thoughts about following the process all the way through? Do you sort of sit down and go through absolutely every element of the task? What do you do to prepare for the sim? I know that's something I would consider. Nuala, do you want to?
Yes, exactly that, Marnie. Just give yourself time and think the whole process through, and what might I do then? What might be said to me? How will this run? And just take time and don't get pressured about it. Just sit and think. We have a lot of time now, so you can just go through some of these scenarios and the SOPs, like Zoe said, and just kind of keep connected with work and the things that you would normally think of when you go to the sim, and sit in your armchair and go through a scenario. I find that really helpful.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of armchair flying at the moment, won't there? In front of I know that Rob, you've mentioned before the use of a cardboard bomber. What sort of, what kind of advice have you got about that?
Well, if you've got access to anything like that, just remembering where switches are is jolly useful. Remembering, what the KRH looks like, silly things like that. But just pick up what Nuala said. I quite often go walking, actually. Well, I walk and then think about, for example, engine failure on takeoff, and just go through, and then inevitably there'll be something I've forgotten because I'm not in the same place, and then I have to look it up and go, oh, okay, that's what I do. So it's quite useful to just keep your mind going through it. Try and get your brain to where you're trying to go to before you get there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If I can just pick up on one last thing, actually, Marnie.
Yes,
just something Alan said about competencies. We mustn't forget just how vital they are. And if you get the competencies right, the rest of it just all falls into place. You're not going to get tripped up by a lack of knowledge on hydraulics or something if your competencies are good. Just keep thinking about the competencies. Get those right. Which I'm sure, if you've been flying in an airline, they will be, because that's what you do. But that is so much of it. If you can actually share your problems and make decisions sensibly and manage your workload and build your essay and all that sort of thing, then the rest of it falls into place.
And maybe we can look at providing a list of competencies. And I mean, a lot of airlines now will be very prescriptive in how they grade their competencies. Ivan, maybe you've got more experience than I have about this, but is that your experience, that they will ask you to go against a matrix, if you like, and effectively tick off what competencies there are?
Yes and no. I think the individual, the subject of the competencies are the main thing, not the little individual things underneath those competencies, but the main thing, like situation awareness or communication. The headline competencies, I think, is what Rob's alluding to, where you and Ellen, if you forget something, then speak up. And let them know. Try not to get distracted on that little thing that you've forgotten. Just ask the question so you're not distracted, because if you are distracted, you'll concentrate on that, and then a whole lot of other things will be go missing, kind of thing. So but yeah, and if you're looking at things to study, like you say, obviously you've got to go through the SOPs. If you go into a simulator, you're going to get an engine failure on takeoff, a single engine go around, and a single engine landing, non-precision approach, ILS, how you're going to do those. Also, your decision making process, revise that, of course. And if you're looking at things to do, just look at your recall items that you need to go over. Once you look at those recall items, it'll force you going back into the books, and when you do go back into the books, you'll pick up other stuff that you've forgotten as well. So there's a start.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really valuable. Memory items, all those sort of good things for the Airbus. I'm pretty sure they cover most Airbus types, not just the A320. Brilliant. Hopefully there's some really valuable advice about dealing with the simulator phase. In my experience of return to work, I've gone into the simulator, I've covered all my non-normals, and I probably haven't done a normal line flight. So we'll have a bit of a look at that, because some people might be doing 3 landings in the simulator and then we'll be out on the line. So what kind of problems or issues do you think we might be facing, especially at the moment with going back, and also if you're going in return to work with the current scenario? What in your experience of normal return to work have you experienced going back on the line compared to what the situation is now and what you might have to experience?
I think, Marnie, I'll kick off with, I think you have there's an element of excitement, and there's an anxiety or a nervousness about getting in the aeroplane again for the first time after being off for a period of time. But I kind of thought about this, your base training, the feelings you had when you were just about to go on your base training trip, that kind of mix of excitement and nerves is kind of there, not quite that level that I probably experienced during my base training, but certainly there's that element of a mixture of emotions and feelings. And this time, obviously, there's a lot that's going to be different for everybody. And we're all going to be feeling at those levels of nervousness, if you like. And to accept that that's perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly normal to feel like that.
And what do you think what other issues are there with line flying that we perhaps don't have in the simulator?
Well, we've got the usual distractions, if you like. We've got our customers. They're going to be in a different place as well. They've experienced the current pandemic. There'll be nervousness, anxiety. Their airport experience is going to be very different. And so the distraction that our customers might bring to our job is going to be heightened, I think, when we return. We've also got we've got other team members to think about as well. Just think our ground handlers, the ground handling team, dispatchers and so on, they will also perhaps be doing return to work. So the potential for errors to creep in for everybody is going to be higher. So cross-checking diligently what we're doing with everybody, taking our time and slowing everything down and making sure everyone is 100% comfortable before moving to the next phase of the flight, if you like. And just allowing for people to take their time to do their job, making sure that we don't put any undue workload on others whilst we do this return to work.
I think that's really valuable advice, Sally, because everything will take you longer. And I guess ordinarily in normal circumstances, we're very focused, or the company is very focused, and that transfers to us about on-time performance. And we're, tendency always looking at the clock. Oh, we got only 3 minutes before we're supposed to push back and all that kind of stuff. And that really has to, even, it's never really important in normal circumstances, but it's even less important in the present situation we're facing. It really doesn't matter if you take a little bit longer. The important thing, I think, is not to put yourself under unnecessary stress and pressure, and just accept that, well, we're probably going to take 10 minutes longer to prepare the flight deck for the next sector, or whatever the case may be. And that's just too bad. It's just something you're going to have to put up with, and the customers are going to have to put up with, and our ground handlers are going to put up with it, and air traffic control and everybody else is just going to have to accept it. Everybody is going to be slow, and everybody is going to have that degree of uncertainty of what they're doing, and are they doing things in the correct sequence. And probably the pushback tractor drivers are going to be slower, and I guess even our line trainers are probably going to be less competent and less proficient, and they're going to be slower as well. So we're all going to be in that situation. And I guess those who've flown with me will know I've never been particularly bothered about on-time performance anyway. If we can achieve it, fine, and if we can't, well, that's just too bad. That's just life, isn't it? You just get on with it. You do it. You do it in the time you can do it, and the time you're comfortable, and that's the way to approach it. I think, not to be over focused on stuff that's really not that important when it comes to safety. That's my take on it, anyway.
I think that also the trainer's there purely to support you and get you back to feeling confident in the seat again. So, if you're aware of anything that might be affecting you personally, just to share that information with the other pilot that you're flying with, because it does make a big difference to share a problem or a thought or an anxiety, because you can move through that phase then, and it enables you to concentrate on the job at hand. If I kind of call like raising your hand, metaphorically, of course. You don't really need to raise your hand in the flight deck. Just if you're not sure about something, like Alan said earlier about the simply not being able to set standard. If those things happen, and just immediately raise it as I don't know how to do this, and it allows you to move on very quickly. And as Ivan said, you then don't get distracted by it and then miss further things down the road. And it's the same, obviously, from the simulator into the aircraft.
Yeah. I think you can take that whole competency thing then, obviously, from the flight deck, from the simulator phase into the line flying phase. Just think about, well, what competencies can I use to compensate for my lack of familiarity? I mean, in a couple of cases when I was returning to work, I was having, fortunately, with the line trainer in the flight deck, on the first pushback, first return to flying sector, thinking, I have absolutely no idea what I'm supposed to be doing next. You have to, nothing is necessarily going to be automatic anymore. You have to think your way through every single thing, or at least I did on the odd occasion anyway. And it just elevates your workload much more, and think about mental workload anyway, and just think about how you can compensate for that. What can you do to alleviate the potential problems that come with that? And taking your time and not being rushed and not being stressed and using other people, etc. And just use the normal tools. I mean, making sure you use the checklist correctly. That will help you to stop making unnecessary errors or lapses or slips or mistakes of judgment or whatever. Just use all the tools you have available.
I know that we've all mentioned at some point the idea of part-time, and how actually sometimes we feel like we're doing return to work on a regular basis. Just from the part-time point of view, what strategies do you use to sort of keep yourself, if you like, in the groove for going back to work? So if you've had an extended leave time, what strategy do you use before you go for a line flight?
I look ahead. I try and get the weather, the NOTAMs, the defects, try and get as much information as you can before you go to work, not in a panicky way, but just in a constructive sort of way. So you've got the big picture before you get there. I really, really try and follow the SOPs, the standard calls, because I feel if I deviate from that at all, I'm just going into no man's land. So it's like Alan and Zoe said, just focus, concentrate, take your time. And if you're not happy, take more time and share the fact that you feel rusty and look after the other person who probably feels rusty too. So.
Thank you, Nuala. Rob, do you have any words of wisdom about how you deal with part-time, perhaps having extended periods off?
Well, one thing I do is whenever I'm sort of looking into the manuals or whatever, I write down questions, things I haven't quite got straight in my head. And on this return to work preparation, I guess most people will find questions, things that they're just not sure about. Bring some of those, or bring those questions with you to your training event, because remember, it's a teamwork, it's team exercise, and so any trainer will be really keen to answer any questions you've got. They might not have all the answers themselves, but that's a really powerful way of getting your own standard up. So, you know, if I go for any sim check or any of my checks, I've nearly always got a couple of questions in my back pocket that I just don't know, and why not share them and build on it. And if it's a question, it's worth dealing with.
Thank you. And Ivan, do you feel that from the trainer's perspective, can you sort of tell those that perhaps have gone through this process compared to those that perhaps have struggled a bit more during the return to work?
I find that, you know, yeah, the first sector, 1 or 2 sectors could be slightly slower than normal, but after 1 or 2 sectors, people generally just fit into where they left off. It only takes 1 or 2 familiarization sectors, flying one pilot flying, one pilot monitoring, and then it's kind of like putting on an old pair of jeans. It just fits, they feel comfortable, and they just get on with it. So it's really, the anxiety is only there for the first 1 sector, maybe possibly 2, but after that, generally people get into it as if they haven't left.
I agree. I agree. Actually, can I just add, handling is very rarely a problem. It's quite interesting, actually. Handling is nearly always no problem at all. I find that most mistakes are made on day 2. So day 1, you do it slowly. You're really focused. Day 2, you start to think, oh yeah, this is okay. I'm okay. You start getting a little bit complacent. And for me, returning, you know, I quite often have a month off flying and then do 2 or 3 days of flying and then go back and have a month off flying. Day 2 is the concerning day for me.
I know that I've been desperate to ask this question. Is anyone else worried about their first landing back? Only for interest. I know it's the biggest joke on the network almost, or any flying. All pilots, I think, worry about critiquing their first landing back. So I just want you to know, I asked the panel this privately, and we all had a good giggle about it. It is a concern, but we've all been there. We all think about it, but that's because we all try and be perfectionists. So I just wanted to reassure the audience on that front. You don't have to answer that question. So we'll move to the next poll. Is if you could, I know that some of you in the audience have been having a few issues trying to answer the polls. Some setups don't allow you to, but actually we've had a really good response rate. So please do keep involved in answering those polls. So our next poll is, Nick, if you could put that up for me. So my main concern about going back to work is, and please could you select one of the following? So thank you very much. If we could just give it a few more seconds. If we could close the poll now, that'd be great. So very interestingly for the audience, just to give you a little bit of feedback, 70% of the audience have said that my technical and motor skills will have deteriorated, which I think hopefully you'll feel a little bit reassured by the fact that I actually think quite often fatigue destroys your technical and motor skills more than time off, because actually remember, you've had the opportunity now to gain sleep, which you may not have done before. You've also had a bit of more of a normal setup, even if it has been slightly more stressful, which brings me on to the next subject quite nicely, our last theme for the discussion, which is a little bit more about well-being. Managing distractions that we're going to face on the line and going back to work, as well as well-being, peer support, and staying positive during this really difficult time. I appreciate that some people will be looking at, they've got to do a return to work quite often with very little notice, and other people are not sure what's going to happen and might be facing either redundancy or a return to work. So I think it's really important that we ask the panel what their sort of advice would be right now on dealing with the environment that we're going to be looking at, and perhaps discuss, you know, our fitness for work combined with how we stay mentally in the right place for being in this position at the moment. So if I could ask the question then, so the environment pilots work in will have changed when we go back. There's no two ways about that. How do we deal with that, and how do we stay fit for work?
I think it just expecting, because we've all, I guess our bodies have all been dealing with a different routine over the last 3 months. Perversely, in the last 3 or 4 days, I've been having to get up early again. I've had the alarm clock set for 4:30 and 4:35 and 4:40 and 4:45 to make sure I get out of bed. And I've found, whereas before, when flying was a regularity, that kind of routine didn't really bother me. I could go do a week of earlies and a week of lates and all that kind of stuff. And because I've been in that cycle for the last 3 decades, it was fine. But I have found in the evenings, in the last few evenings, having had to get up at 4:30, I'm completely crackered by 6 o'clock in the evening. So your body will have adjusted somewhat to now in the last few months, sort of waking up when it's bright and wanting to go to sleep when it's dark, whereas that's not necessarily the routine we've lived with for so many years. So I think managing your rest before you go to work and even after you return to work, and making sure you get proper sleep and get the time your body needs to recover to, and you will need a bit of time to readjust back to our abnormal work cycle, I think. So really getting good sleep and making sure you're resting properly is going to be a key thing. I've found it particularly in the last few days. Is rather odd getting back to the odd routine we accepted as being our norm. Sleep hygiene.
I think as well that there is a bit of research that suggests it takes about a year for you to actually get back into what would be considered a normal 9 to 5 routine with regards to sleep, because of the shift work that we do. So bear that in mind for the fact that we've only had 3 or 4 months off. But your skill level will actually not have deteriorated as much as you think, because you now have the advantage that you are now in theory fresh for work, which will be a new concept. So what other sort of factors do you think we need to consider about this current time at the moment?
I would say there's control what's within your own remit. There's a lot of anxiety and negativity around, and just be selective about who you choose to listen to and talk to. Try and talk with positive colleagues and supportive colleagues. There's plenty of people around who are positive. There's a lot of worry mongers and people predicting doom and devastation, but like we've all said this morning, there's a lot of things that you can control and things you can prepare really well for, and just look after that side of, be selective on social media and what you choose to get dragged into, I would say.
Very valuable advice, Nuala. I think we've all experienced days where things aren't going quite so well on social media, and I think it's important to learn when to switch off and protect yourself a little bit. What are the other issues that you can see in sort of going back to work? Rob, do you want to?
Well, I just want to pick up on what Nuala just said. One of my favourite return to works was with a colleague. He was a captain older than me, who thought he'd never fly again, and got his medical back. And we did 2 days of line training. And his first day, he was just so excited and said, "If I for the whole of this time I was off, I thought, if I can just do this 1 day of flying, I'll be happy." And then, of course, the next day we went flying, and he did another day of flying, and the positivity was wonderful. And I think that's one of the things that we ought to all hang on to is, don't listen to the negative people. The positive thing is that is that, you know, if you're doing return to work, you're returning to work, and the positive thing is to go and enjoy it. And I think that's everything. Just hang on that positivity.
Fantastic. And Zoe?
I just thought more along the lines of the practical side of things when we actually go back to work. Things like knowing the procedures for getting to work, how you're going to get to work, where you're going to park your car, work out what that process is. Do you need to bring your own masks? Thinking about sharing equipment, so that kind of goes down more to do with the flight deck cleaning and that sort of thing. Kind of understanding the practicalities. One of the things I did think about, and I was thinking about drinking, is actually food and drink when you get to work. We're going to have very little idea as to exactly what's going to be available to us. So just the practical side of taking a water bottle with you to work so that you can fill it airside with water, on the basis that you don't know whether the company will have water available for you to drink other than from the aircraft systems, the aircraft water tank, which personally I don't think is the best thing to drink, and certainly not with an aircraft that hasn't been flown with passengers and catering and water for quite some time. So it's kind of those kind of practical things, what, you know, hot drinks that you want to take with you, what and what food you're going to need for the entire day to keep yourself basically fit and healthy, and the sleep hygiene that Alan was talking about as well. Those are the more practical things that you can think about, and they give you a more positive angle for when you do go back to work. You thought these things through before you arrive at work. Just preparation. It's stuff that we do very well as pilots. Just prepare yourself.
Yeah.
Alan, did you want to add something?
No, I just sort of reflecting back on my last flight. I don't know, some sort of, I don't know, one of the last flights anyway, back from Spain before everything shut down, when I guess we were all becoming extremely concerned about the whole coronavirus thing and really not knowing where it was going to go and to what degree it would be a problem. But there was a huge amount of concern, and I probably have to confess, I probably went a bit over the top on being concerned. I was, you know, furiously disinfecting every, you know, controlled surface I could think of, and probably quite selfishly trying to isolate myself from the passengers without having to think, well, my poor old cabin crew are having to be exposed to these people coming back from Spain who may or may not have been affected by coronavirus, and how it impacted them. But I just think, like I was saying, sort of be prepared, do the things you can do. I suppose, as Nuala was alluding to with or was it you, Marnie? I can't remember, the new SOPs about hygiene, you know, physical hygiene in the flight deck, and just complying with all of those things, and mitigating whatever the threat is as best we can. And once you've done that, well, you've done what you can do, and you just have to get on with it at that stage and not stress about it anymore. Follow the procedures and work on the assumption that they are the best we can do to protect ourselves. And
I think that's going to be our biggest distraction, isn't it? That recognizing that the changing procedures for the health measures is going to be quite a big distraction. And again, it goes back to the same thing we talked about before, which is just taking your time, doing what you need to do.
Sorry. I think it will become the new norm. It's a bit sort of similar to post 9/11. You know, things change radically after with respect to cockpit security and whatnot. And for those of us who flew before 9/11, when everything was a bit more relaxed and very open, post 9/11 things have changed. That just has become the new norm. And whatever we do after coronavirus will become the new norm. It will just become what we do. It will become a different world to some extent, probably, which will never go back to how it was before, perhaps. But it will become completely normalized very quickly. And not too much to worry about, I suppose.
Well,
Sort of fester in our heads about what may or may not be going on.
really important. So we've concluded now, unless anyone would like to add anything about how to manage distractions, well-being. I just would like to mention a few things. I don't want to mention anything about peer support, where if pilots do feel that they want to get some peer support. Do any of you have any advice about that?
I think the only advice is to know what's available to you, either via your company or other professionals, and to make use of it if you need it. Don't be fearful. It's there purely to support you. So please just go ahead and make use of any services that you think you might need.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I can't stress that enough.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, sorry, Alan.
No, I was just going to say, be open, be prepared to if you like, confess early to whatever weaknesses or concerns you have, just to rather than thinking, oh, I can't admit that I can't remember how to do something, or I can't remember what a certain computer does, or whatever the case may be. Just be open about what your concerns may be open about what your areas of weakness may be, if you feel you have them, and then share it, like I think Rob also was saying earlier. People are going to be supportive, and just use that support. In my case,
I think it's really
I do, that's for sure.
I think it's really important to understand that actually in the past, perhaps pilots have always been seen as those that never struggle with life events of things being stressed. We're not allowed to be seen to be doing that publicly. I think that's something that we need to move forward on. And there's a lot of peer support programs. There's a lot of companies will have internal counselling services that they offer. And it's really, really important that you do make use of that. We've included a few links. Some of the unions offer a lot of support at the moment if you have any concerns about jobs specifically, and also there's things you can get involved in if you want to start even. I found I've never been in so much contact with my peers, which is positive that's come out of this this whole event, that now I feel better connected than ever before with my colleagues, which is good compared to the one day a year or every 2 years that I get to have a coffee with them. So this has had a positive thing. What I will say is I just want to run our last poll for the day, which is related to this. If you could put the last poll up, which is, have you yourself sought any advice from pilot support services during this pandemic? If you could just answer that. Okay, so 80% of people have voted. If we could close the poll, that's great, thank you. And just for some feedback, I always think it's really good to give feedback if you've been kind enough to answer the question. So actually 90% have said no, they haven't sought for any help from peer support. If you do feel you want to, even just a quick chat, even offering your services to peer support, getting involved and staying connected is really, really important at this time. There's lots of charity work going on out there just to keep you in the loop and keep you busy, really important. So that concludes our webinar for today on returning to work. I really hope you found it useful. I'd like to put out some questions now. If you could write in your questions and we will direct them at the panel and take it from there, really. So if you want to use your sidebar to put the questions in, that would be great. So one of the questions that has come in was related to how easy is it to transfer? How do I gain confidence in transferring, for example, a landing to my colleague? So how do we get over that to sort of to ensure that if you're a captain, for example, that your first officer feels comfortable in doing the landing? How do we assess that in this current time if they've had a long time off work?
I think one thing is be honest. If you're, a low experienced pilot, a low experienced FO, and you don't want to have your confidence damaged, then feel very free to say to your captain, actually, I'd rather not do the landing today. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm sure he or she, won't criticise you for that. I think building confidence is something you've got to do in a measured way. So don't feel that, if your first day back at work is in howling crosswinds, and you haven't done that many crosswinds in the past, why put yourself there?
I think that's a really important point, actually, Rob, is the fact that if you are in the position advising which end you're going to do a landing at. Make sure it's easy. If the person is low hours, don't make it impossible. We're all there to support and build experience for our colleagues, and that includes those that are slightly lower hours. So on that note, those people that are returning to work with low hours, captains will be supportive of you. There's no reason why they're there to make sure that you're comfortable as well. It's not just training department. Captains will be there as well.
Also,
do we have? Yeah.
I also, Marnie, that this may also be the question of, I'm a captain and I'm flying with my first officer, and at the moment I'm feeling slightly less comfortable myself about giving the landing to the first officer because of the, if anything does happen, the recovery that I would need to put in place. So it's not just low-hour first officers who might feel uncomfortable. And I think, and we should all as captains be back in the seat and feeling very comfortable, but we've all been off for quite some time. So there's going to be some normalizing around, actually, I've only done one landing in the week that I've been back at work. I need to do more than that today, or not feeling comfortable. And it's perfectly acceptable for a captain to not feel comfortable about handing over control immediately as soon as we return to work. So there's quite a few different angles to that question, I think.
Maybe from a captain's perspective, it's best that we open that conversation in the first place.
Absolutely.
Just provoke that conversation with first officer. Are you comfortable? Would you rather not do this landing, even if it's their sector and they get to, I don't know, you get to 1,500 feet above the ground and you can see a degree of anxiety. That there should be no shame felt by anyone by sort of saying, listen, I'm just not comfortable with this, you have control, or whatever the case may be. So from our side, just keep asking the questions, I guess, not incessantly, but just make sure that we provide that conduit for our colleagues to say, no, I'd rather I don't do it. And you have to go.
Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely. I mean, that's a very good point, the fact that actually captains haven't been flying either, and may need to feel they need to get back into it. So it's very much a team effort to get yourselves back into the seat.
I think the other thing I do as a part-timer, if I haven't flown for a bit, instead of trying to be stable just for 4,000 feet, I'll threaten air manage it and make it 1,500 feet or whatever, to build in a bit of a margin. So I think it's quite reasonable when you've come back from a period of time off, just to build your safety margins a bit more.
I think sometimes it's probably more or easier for a newly qualified pilot to do the landing as opposed to a more experienced pilot, because the more experienced pilot, they've got so used to landing they don't think about it anymore. Whereas the newly qualified pilot is still thinking about it. So as an experienced pilot, I kind of go through the process and go, well, where do I look and how do I do it and stuff like that. And so a good thing to do is go through, read the flight crew techniques manual and think about where you're looking during the landing process, like approaching 50 feet, et cetera, looking towards the end of the runway. Whereas a newly qualified pilot, they're still kind of thinking about this process, whereas more experienced pilot, they've all forgotten about it and they just do it naturally because they've done it so many times. So think about the landing process.
That's a really valid point, Ivan. I'm sure a lot of us have had that experience where we think, okay, what went wrong? We actually take ourselves back to basics. So there you go. For anyone who's worried about being low hours, please don't. We're all in the same boat. Another one that we've come through is a question regarding, do you think return to work courses are generally being given enough time to get to the required standard? And one of their concerns is that with the current climate, would we see perhaps the minimum time being available as opposed to extra time being available because of what we're currently going through?
Well, I can only, as I mentioned, my previous experience on certainly one occasion, anyway, my line training phase, I just sort of said I need more time, I guess, and it was provided. So being open with people providing your training is going to be important, and the company has no interest in you returning to line flying without feeling competent or being competent and feeling safe and feeling secure. So I guess the opposite of that, if the company going to have so many people in the return to work pipeline, they will want to get you through inevitably with the minimum amount of time and investment. However, I would say definitely, you know, don't allow yourself to be pressurized into being signed off unless you're absolutely comfortable. You know, ask for the extra time, tell them you need it, and don't be shy about admitting it and being open about it, because you
I
don't
think
want to be feeling unsafe, and neither does the company.
Well, as a bit of my own experience, when I first joined the industry, I started flying in 2001. Well, I was flying before September 11th and was actually laid off for 6 or 7 weeks during my line training. And actually, the airline were really supportive and actually allowed an extra 10 sectors for every cadet that had been in that position. And I don't think that's unusual. The airline, if they're going to train you, they're not going to invest half the money in your training and then take you out of the training system. They want to see you get through and to a competent level as quickly as possible. So I think generally return to work courses are going to be tight anyway. The airline is going to want to get you back at the minimum standard, but if you do need extra, they can't reduce a course if you turn up to work being fantastic. You still have to go through the minimum. So generally what happens is an airline will put the minimum amount of hours forward and then give you extra if you need it. They won't do it the other way around, give you plenty of hours only to find out you don't need them all. So I don't think that theme will change. If I'm very honest, they can't go down that road. Thank you. So moving on to, unless anyone would like to add to that question, we'll move on to the next one. This is for newly qualified pilots who perhaps haven't had any real jet experience and have passed their MCC qualifications quite recently. What would you advise them to do in terms of getting back into the saddle? Do you think they'll be disadvantaged when it becomes that the recruitment process opens up again? So what advice would you give to pilots that were just about to join the industry who'd perhaps completed MCC courses? How can they keep themselves in the loop with what's going on? What's your advice? Especially, I mean, at the moment, for example, how would you? I'd perhaps recommend it before going for a job interview, perhaps getting some sim time and getting there's going to be quite a few courses around that they could do, perhaps the odd sim just to get themselves back in the loop. I think generally people are very supportive of pilots once they do decide to join the industry. There are loads of pilots out there that would help keep people's type ratings up and offer sim time. And I think it's really important to have seek resources where you can get your CV up to date and also look at perhaps doing a short MCC course, renewing some of refresher training. I don't know if you would agree with that.
I think, strangely enough, probably the people who've only recently done the MCC courses may well be those who you know, if they're given the opportunity, would be best placed to do a return to work, because as we all know, the MCC is focused on the competencies, and I think the competencies are going to be the big thing that's going to help people in the system return to work best. They'll be more aware, perhaps, and because that's how they've been graded on their courses, about situational awareness and being effective communications and giving proper briefings and sharing a mental model of what's going on, etc., what you're hoping to happen. Much more focused on knowledge and application of procedures, because that's all they've really been considering as part of their MCC course, mostly what they've been considering anyway. So progressively, although they may feel insecure, weirdly, they're probably one of the group who's best placed to make a successful return to work, or even coming to work and being successful on a type rating course. So I think the whole competency skill set will be much more to the front of their mind, and it probably in some ways be more make the whole coming to work, returning to work easier for them.
I have to say, Marnie, those that had finished, like you say, but hadn't started in their airline training, don't forget that when you go back in history, that was very much the norm. Quite some years ago, when there was a number of different avenues for getting into the airline industry, you would complete your MCC, but you may not actually get a job for several months or years after completing that course. So this is nothing new, and keeping your skill sets skill set alive with, like you said, simulator time if that's what you wish to do, but also yourself as an individual working out your strategy for the next 12 months and what you're going to use this valuable time that you have between finishing your training course and perhaps starting with an airline. It's to make good use of that time to ensure that your CV is as good as it can be, so that you're an attractive proposition to future employers. If that was the question, was in between where you haven't got an employer at this particular point in time, and that, you know, reaching out to the peer groups that, like you say, Marnie, we're more connected now than we ever were before, and just reach out and ask for help, whether that's just simply things like CV creation, or what you can do in the interim period between the end of your flying and the starting of your flying career, and your training, sorry, and the start of your flying career.
Brilliant bit of advice.
If I just finished my MCC course, but had time between from now to going to an airline, I think I'd be getting hold of the SOPs that you used during the MCC course, and go back and over it again and try and understand why the SOPs are written the way they are, and try and get your head in it and try and keep your mind in that groove. And maybe on the aircraft type that you did the MCC course on, you know, now's the time to do some rather unpressurized learning on it. You know, there's access to manuals on it. Maybe just take a system and try and understand it. You know, take hydraulics again, just have a think about it, and just try and understand why these things are built the way they are. And because this is stuff you can do for free, and you want to keep your interest, you want to keep your head in the right place. And then when an opportunity arises, it will be a lot easier for you to answer questions in an interview.
That's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We've just had another question from someone who's asking the panel, in your vast experience, what's the best way of doing your armchair flying and SOP practice? Do you use props, or do you just simply close your eyes and walk through the process?
Personally, one thing I do is when I did my return to work, my own one, and I'd had about a year off, I made notes of all the things I didn't know in the SOPs, and I was horrified to find out how many notes I'd written, actually. But anyway, the point was that if you, for me, that worked quite well, because I ended up with a notebook with various notes in, which basically were things that I wasn't absolutely 100% certain about. And then I had to either commit it to memory or just know that there was an issue. And in my particular case, when I'd had my return to work, while I'd been off, the company I'm with had changed the way we do performance quite significantly. So for me, there was a real area, in other words, performance, that I knew I was going to struggle on. So I was sort of forewarned before I went back.
Anyone else have any tips about how they would do their armchair flying? Do they tend to sit in front of a cardboard bomber, or do you just mentally run through? I know I actually write my profiles down, so I'll actually write down everything I can remember on a whole flight, if you like, bringing it all the way back down to landing and what factors I would consider. But does anyone else have an alternative strategy?
Well, I sort of tend to mentalize it, if that's a word, sort of go through it in a sort of an imaginary scenario in my head, and you know, right through the whole process of getting to the airplane. What do I do? Whether it's I'm doing the walk around, what am I checking, and just in a virtual world in my own head, just go through the whole process and actually getting into the flight deck and preparing the flight deck and dealing with performance and tech logs and all sorts of, you know, weird stuff you might just have forgotten about, and taxiing out. What do I do? Just refreshing in my own head the SOPs and working my way through the whole flight, albeit a short one. And I think that was for me, that's a useful way of provoking points in that whole flight process where I think, oh, now I can't remember what I do now. I better go and look it up. So rather than going through a whole set of manuals, I've just sort of tried to identify the low bits that I really need to focus on, and then focusing on those. But everyone's going to have their own strategy that works for them. I guess that's just what I do. I tend to internalize it, if you like, and I quite frankly do the same thing even in fact, when I line up in the runway in the actual aircraft, I tend to rehearse things in my head, thinking, right, what happens if something goes wrong before 100 knots? What am I going to do? And as we pass 100 knots in the takeoff, I'm thinking, right, now we're past 100 knots. Now what am I going to do if something goes wrong? And I just sort of keep refreshing that process in my head all the time. And that's just my strategy anyway.
I think what's quite interesting is quite often we learn these techniques while we're doing our first type rating, when we first start our careers. And what you have to remember is that actually, unless you're going on a new aircraft type, every time you do a return to work course or you're running through the SOPs again, you've actually done this before, so you're not learning it from scratch. And I think that's quite it's quite surprising how actually every return to work course I've done, I've used it as a positive opportunity to refresh my skills that perhaps have degraded slightly because I haven't used them in a while. So, which brings me on to a very interesting question which has been sent in from a very low hours captain who had recently qualified a matter of weeks before the lockdown. And they were just wondering whether, as a newly qualified captain, they're probably going to not be returning to work that soon. Are there any other things that you would recommend they look at during this downtime if you were newly qualified?
Do you know, I think just from a newly qualified perspective, I can understand that the levels of anxiety increase because they haven't done the job for a very long period of time. But first of all, that the company will adapt their training packages to accommodate those where they've recognised that they hadn't had the opportunity to build their skills before lockdown occurred. So that I would expect that most companies would acknowledge that the additional training that you might need when you do go back. But in the meantime, certainly from the Airbus perspective, or I'm very happy the same as well, is go back to the real basics, go back to the golden rules, go back to Airbus's golden rules, read them and really understand them. That you can actually access the Airbus Win platform. It's mainly aimed at instructors, but there's videos there on the operating philosophy of the Airbus. Go back and really think about those things. Think about your failure management strategy and all that work you did as part of your command preparation, if you like, and revise those things, the kind of softer skills and how you're going to manage things, and run scenarios in your head just like you did before you did your command course. Obviously now having the benefit of actually having operated or passed your command course just before the lockdown, and kind of really just go back to basics. It might be worth looking at some of the newer Airbus systems perhaps that were being introduced as we before lockdown, so autopilot, flight director TCAS, for example. Some of those newer ones that we wouldn't necessarily have practiced very much. ROPS is another one that comes to in the top of my head. Fans C. Have a look at some of those newer systems that you might not have had an opportunity to look at during your command course process, and re-knowledge yourself on those things.
Ironically, I think as a new captain, you're actually very well versed in the rules and Part A. So actually, you're probably more up to speed than on a return to work course. Generally, I wouldn't go through page for page Part A. I would just know where to find stuff. So actually, as a new captain, those skills won't disappear. You'll still have those months of preparation that you put in before you did your commands process. It would just be, as everyone's saying, I think failure management and how you're going to manage your team will probably be the bits that might be worth looking at as well. I don't know if anyone else would like to add to that.
Well, especially on scenarios, if you're worried about scenarios as a new captain, one technique you can use is get a load of cards. On one set of cards, write down some scenarios. So I don't know, toilet smoke or hydraulic failure or whatever. On the other set of cards, write down the phase of the flight. So taxi out, take off, climb, cruise, descent, approach, landing even, and taxiing in. And then on the other set of cards, put a load of weathers. So it might be CAV-OK, LVOs, thunderstorms, strong crosswinds, whatever. And then you've got 3 sets of cards. Deal the cards, and you end up with a scenario. And then have a think about the scenario, and just get your head in that moment. So you sort of think, okay, if I have this this hydraulic failure in LVOs, and I get it in the climb, how does that work? And it gives, what it does, it gives you a chance to get your head into gear. And I think as a new captain, especially, that's probably what you're most nervous of. How would you deal with these things? So maybe that's one way.
And
Nuala, you were going to.
Yeah, I I was just going to add, as well as all those things that you can sort of rehearse at home, have a think about unexpected things happening, perhaps with passengers or cabin crew being anxious about things, kind of the non-technical stuff, but that you have to manage as the captain. And just maybe ask some other captains or colleagues their experience of events that have happened that have had people management issues rather than as well as technical. So that would be, because they're the things that will come and surprise you that you haven't been able to sort of rehearse for.
That's absolutely true. It's normally, they always say everything happens in your first 6 months of command, don't they? And then hopefully you have a nice quiet career after that. Well, that's what we all hope for.
Well, especially if you're furloughed for the first 3 months of it.
Well, exactly. It's very quiet. So just on the other end of the scale, I've just got somebody who has mentioned something at the beginning of their career, saying that they find the FCOM particularly daunting. Does anyone have any advice about a structure that they might follow about what systems to study in, instead of going through the FCOM page for page, or we can't now. I did it when we had 20 manuals and it was actually seemed a lot easier. But do you have any tips on how to tackle the or structure your approach to learning or maintaining tech knowledge?
Yeah, I don't know whether this is the best piece of advice, but perfectly frankly, I've never been that obsessed with reading the systems part of the FCOM anyway, because well, first of all, my first encounter with Airbus FCOM, it was unintelligible. You couldn't actually read it to make sense of it because it wasn't written by pilots. It was written by goodness knows who, but it certainly wasn't written in such a way that I could understand it anyway. Maybe that's a reflection on my capacity, I don't know. But what I did is I focused on the abnormal scenarios and then took that to the relevant parts of the FCOM systems, if you like. And so what piece of technical knowledge do I particularly need in order to relate that to the failure I'm looking at? Whether that's useful advice or even good advice, I have no idea, but that's the only way I could cope with actually making sense of the system side of it, because there's a huge amount of knowledge and data in the system section, which quite frankly, in my opinion, it's useless information because there's nothing you can do with it. If the information is not useful to how you operate the aircraft, I don't really see the point in you actually acquiring that information in the first place. So my suggestion, what helps for me, is just to acquire the knowledge that's going to be useful and necessary and help you deal with whatever scenario you may encounter.
I think that links back nicely to what Rob said.
Metaphorically, but anyway, that's just my approach to it anyway.
Zoe?
I think that links nicely with what Rob said, is with his card scenario, is picking a scenario and then learning the knowledge that's required for that scenario, rather than a very methodical start to finish of the FCOM, which you just simply can't do. It's just not. Well, you'll fall asleep for a start. I mean, if you ever have insomnia, that is definitely the manual to go to. And so it's much more enjoyable process if you take each of the systems, come up with one failure that system has, and start looking at it and go, well, I wonder why that is. Why do I press that button? What happens when I press that button as part of that procedure? And then it gives you a question to answer, and that's much easier to answer a question by looking at the FCOM than there is just reading the FCOM. So learning about exactly what it is that procedure is doing.
There is also, I think we're running out of time here. So what I will say is, without wanting to advertise anything in particular, there are some fantastic apps and things you can get on the internet going through ECAM procedures, which are definitely an area that the FCOM is really difficult to understand. So Google some A320, A330, 40, Airbus stuff, and see what's on the available on the internet. There's some really good apps out there that can really help you get your head back into dealing with ECAM procedures. We've run out of time. For those of you who I haven't managed to get to their questions, please do refer to the handouts, and we'll be able to try and answer, or send in your email, and we'll try and answer those questions for you. In the handout, we've got a lot of links that you can go to for getting involved in different charities and things. So please do have a look at that. There's some really good stuff in there. So I'd like to just say that I hope you've enjoyed our webinar today. It has explored some of the issues that we all face going back to work. I hope you feel reassured that actually we're all in the same boat. No matter what experience level you've got, we've got some really experienced people on the panel, and we all have these anxieties that we have to face going back to work in difficult times. But be reassured, everyone's in the same boat and we're all there to support each other. So thank you to the panel, thank you to the Royal Aeronautical Society, and please do get in touch if you would like any more information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.